This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. The idea that a nation has an original sin that animates much of its character is a common concept. Today we'll look at how the United States hoped to avoid corruption with its very founding documents, and one scholar's thesis suggesting that modern Turkey's original sin serves as an excuse for authoritarianism today. Zephyr Teachout is known to many as a recent candidate for the Democratic nomination for governor of New York, but she's also a law professor at Fordham University. We discuss her book, Corruption in America, From Benjamin Franklin's Snuffbox to Citizens United. And then, Fatma Muge Gocek grew up in Turkey, a Muslim believing that there had been no such thing as an Armenian genocide. Her work since then has endeavored to shine a light not only on that truth, but on what failing to recognize that truth does to Turkey. Her book is Denial of Violence, Ottoman Past, Turkish Present, and Collective Violence Against the Armenians, 1789 to 2009. But first, here's my interview with Zephyr Teachout. So my curiosity is piqued. What is Benjamin Franklin's Snuffbox?
When Franklin was ending his diplomatic tour of France, he'd been there for many years and really well loved by the French. He was given a diamond-encrusted snuff box with a portrait of the King of France on it from the king. And there was some outrage and concern that this was going to corrupt Benjamin Franklin, that he would then take French economic interests too warmly in the future. Right. And the reason I think it's so important is because it led to a provision in our Constitution that's still there that forbids taking a gift of any kind whatever from a foreign power without getting permission of Congress. So it shows something about how the framers of the Constitution and the early Americans were really fussy about corruption.
The psychology or the philosophy of it, I think, is a fascinating thing, because corruption is not like stealing. It's not like murder, because you can say, oh, well, that is theft because you took something from someone. That is murder because you did something. But you didn't corrupt something. You can't corrupt an object. You can't just simply, you can't say, oh, I corrupted today.
For the first really 120 years, there was no criminal law to speak of that prosecuted people for bribery. But one of the provisions of most criminal bribery statutes is that a thing of value is given to someone in a position of authority with intent to influence their behavior, and there's often a provision that says corruptly. So then juries have to decide, well, were those cookies given to that judge corruptly? Right. What does corruptly mean? And so it's actually, to your point, it's a really hard fit with criminal law in that way, because it's hard to figure out when something is done corruptly and when it's not.
Right, so how has that been decided at different times over the course of American
history? Not early on, really up until 1976, courts saw one of their jobs as protecting against temptation, protecting against different influences. Lobbying was against the law for about 100 years in our history, and courts would refuse to enforce contracts to lobby. If you and I made a lobbying contract, you successfully go and persuade Albany to pass the law I want, and then come back and ask for your pay. I'd say, no, I'm not going to pay you, and the court would agree with me that it's sort of like a contract for prostitution. It's so outside of the realm of, it's so corrupting that they wouldn't enforce them. And then for the first, really until the 70s, bribery statutes, the juries were just given extraordinary leeway to decide what was corrupt and what wasn't. And then that's been narrowing a lot in the last 30, 40 years.
And now, the University of Michigan's Fatma Muge Gocek on coming to terms with the Armenian genocide and with failures to do so. When we're talking about this periodic violence, sometimes it's committed by militias, and sometimes you describe several pogroms. And one of the more interesting things that come out of your analysis is this idea that in denying this violence, you have to do certain mental tricks, and you have to jump through certain mental hoops, and that in doing so, you create the kind of society that allows for authoritarianism.
Exactly. And that is what makes it so tragic, because when people usually argue that denial is the last stage of genocide, because when you deny suffering, you do not allow people who have been, of course, victimized to heal. so the wounds keep bleeding, and that is why it's important. And all along, people have always focused on the victims and how victims were devastated, as they were, of course, by the violence they suffered. But nobody looked at the perpetrators and what the denial does to the perpetrators. And in that context, what I realized is that if the perpetrators, in this case Turkish state and society, if they do not account for what happened, if they are not held accountable, they normalize the violence in their society, and as a consequence, they cannot fully become democratic.
And the denial here is particularly problematic, not just within Turkey, but outside of Turkey. It has been a key element, for instance, in the breakdown of relations between Turkey and Israel.
I always wondered, since this has happened in 1915, before the establishment of the Turkish Republic, I said, well, you know, they could always say this is something that happened before our republic, and therefore, you know, we're sorry, and then move on. And I couldn't understand why the Turkish Republic did not acknowledge what had happened. Then I started researching, and I realized that many of the perpetrators of the genocide then became the leaders of the Turkish Republic. It's because of that continuity that, unfortunately, this Armenian genocide became the foundational violence of the Turkish Republic. The denial continues to this day, and 2015, as you know, is going to be the centennial of the genocide. And the Turkish state, from what I gather, is only going to focus on the Dardanelles and the sort of their successful defense against the British during World War I, and they will not focus on the Armenian genocide at all.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast, available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable, Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOFM Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.